Welcome to this video where I will cover the basic motivations for UBI and some that are not so often discussed, but I think show the appeal of a UBI given the previous egalitarian theories that we have studied before. So first of all, let's answer one sort of basic question. What is UBI? And UBI stands for Universal Basic Income, and that's kind of all you need to know when it comes to knowing what a UBI is, right? So the first component of a UBI, universality, meaning that it is unconditional, is given to all citizens, maybe age above 18, right, or adults, right, residents in a particular country, regardless of whether they contribute or whether they're working or not. Second, basic, meaning that people are able to survive when they have been given this UBI. Finally, an income, meaning that it comes during a fixed period of time and it's not a one-off payment, but rather it comes maybe perhaps monthly or yearly, so that you can use this money and there's no restrictions on how you spend it, right? Now, of course, there's an important complication here, because UBI can take many forms, right? So not everyone thinks that UBI has to be universal. It can be restricted in some way, or it might be in some way tapered, right? So some people above a certain income level will get more UBI than others, right? That's the sort of idea. Anyway, so in reality, we can think of UBI as lying on a continuum here, right? So where there's targeted, right? Meaning it's of targeted at specific groups, maybe say lower income or the elderly, something like that. And then it might be mixed, right? Because there might be differing amounts for differing groups. So maybe it might be 1,500 for the elderly and lower income individuals, and then it might be 2,500 for the handicapped or disabled, and then it might be 800 for the able-bodied and those who are working, so on and so forth, right? And then on the other spectrum is the universal, where it's the same for everyone receives the same benefits. That is kind of the idea that there's a sort of spectrum, right, on which all UBI policies lie, as it were. Another important distinction is to ask whether UBI is a supplement or it is a replacement. So if it's supplement, as the name implies, right, then it is on top of existing social welfare policies. So, for example, if UBI is a supplement, then what that means is that it will be given on top of existing social policies such as welfare or social spending or subsidies for education and things like that. But if UBI is a replacement, then it's seeking to replace and remove social welfare policies. So if UBI is a replacement and we implement UBI, then we will have no housing aid, we have no education subsidies, etc. So then now we come to the larger question. Why have a UBI in the first place? And one of the sort of prevailing thoughts is that UBI is important because a society needs to meet everyone's basic needs, right? This idea here, as you can see, and this is even in the Singaporean context, where this answer, well, what is it that every person needs, right? And how can we ensure that we have universalism in meeting fundamental needs such as healthcare, retirement security, to prevent everyone from precarity. So this idea is that we do not want people to fall through the cracks. We want to ensure that we can meet their basic needs, right? And even in a country like Singapore, right, where it's generally wealthy, people are sort of comfortable in, right? Although that's not to say that there's no poverty, right? As we have seen here, there's food insecurity. So this idea that in order to prevent people from falling through the cracks, we need to have a sort of basic income level. Another important thought as to why UBI might be very helpful is because the economy is changing. And we'll get to these kinds of changes in a bit, right? Other sort of changes in a bit, right? But one big change is this fear of automation, right? That if economies, as they are continually seeking to become more and more efficient and rely on robots to enable different functions, then we will have mass unemployment. And when we have such mass unemployment, a UBI is necessary to help us to prevent the sort of huge fallout that would emerge from this kind of massive unemployment structure. And then the idea would be also another idea that we'll talk about shortly, is that UBI might change work, right? It might rethink our relations between people, and we'll look at that a bit more carefully too. Another often overlooked reason is that UBI might actually help democratization. So what is democracy in this sort of minimal sense? Is that it's collective self-determination, right? It's a group of people making decisions, right, for the group, the country making decisions for the country, the citizens of the country deciding collectively what policies should be enacted. So there is this idea that in giving ourselves the choice, we enhance our individual autonomy, right? We make the choices ourselves, right? And we also enable us to engage in collective self-determination, right? And so democracy requires us to protect individual rights and liberties, and also at the same time enable us to make collective decisions, which we typically make through political participation and through voting. To make this a bit clearer, right? One of the sort of most touted benefits of UBI is that it is said to often avoid the patronizing scrutiny of the government. That's the idea, right? That we saw with Luck egalitarianism, is this idea that if you try to distinguish between citizens and who gets more and who gets less, right, then you get into this big problem of having to make public decisions about who deserves more and who deserves less. And so UBI, by giving everyone the same amount, right, avoids this kind of problem. But UBI might also be thought of as more than just reforming how we think about, how we provide for citizens, right? It can be a different way of relating individuals to the society. Specifically, there's this idea that UBI will enable democratization and also enhance women's freedom. So let's look at these two ideas in a bit more detail. So first of all, we should ask the question, right? When we talk about UBI here, right, what do we mean, right? First, there's an assumption that the basic income should be able not to cover a modest but still a decent standard of living. What does decent standard of living mean here is one question that I also have that we will examine in class is, what do you think is required for the standard of living, right? And here, UBI is different from just simply alleviating poverty, right? It's this idea that we should give people more than enough, right, than just what they need to survive, right? But for them to able to have to spend on some discretionary income on certain leisure activities, for them to be able to pursue other things other than work so that they can survive. So the thought is that participation, especially democratic participation, might be enhanced by UBI. So in effect, inequality and affects participation. This is a claim that we will look at more carefully in the next few weeks. But the basic idea is this, that in countries like the US, for example, where you have quite a lot of wealth and income inequality, the rich are 2.5 times more likely to vote than the poor. So why is that the case, right? Some political scientists and political philosophers think that that's because it is costly for people to participate. This is something that we have discussed in class before. How inequality might result in economic inequality, might result in political inequality. And one of the hypotheses we discussed is that potentially the rich have more time, freer time to engage in certain kinds of activities like lobbying, like talking to their political representatives, and also voting, because they can take the day off, they can easily access transport, they are more likely to know where's the polling booth and so on, because they have time and they have energy to refer to these kinds of resources. So the basic idea is that political participation is costly, especially with respect to things like lobbying, petitioning your representatives, and voting. So now you might ask, well, what evidence do we have for this claim? And I want you to do a short thought experiment. You can pause the video to do this, right? Think about the time when you're considering participating in a civic activity, whether it's voting, student union, RC activities, grassroots, but you didn't decide against it. What made you decline, right? Perhaps that gives you an insight into the kinds of costs that might be involved in political participation. Now you might say, well, Joel, but in Singapore it's compulsory voting, so we don't have this problem. Well, not quite right. So I'm going to post a link to this video, regardless of class, by Channel News Asia, where they suggest that, as you can see from the subtitles, that people from the higher socioeconomic classes, SES, are much more likely to participate in various civic activities than people from the lower SES. And one question as to why that might be the case is something, as I said, worth thinking about in your own personal experience. But if this is true, we do seem to see generally across societies where participation, where voting is compulsory, that political participation might be costly, because there seems to be this kind of gap between the wealthier and the not so wealthy in terms of participation, among other things. So then the question is, how would a UBI help? Well, first of all, premise one, as we already discussed, is participation is costly because it requires time, right? You have to go to the polling booth, you have to wait long lines, especially if you are in America. In Singapore also, the recent elections were not that efficient as they were previously, so there were pretty long waiting lines, not helped of course by the COVID situation, right? You need effort, and sometimes you need monetary resources to spend money to take a car there, or bus, transport, things like that. So obviously, if you have some money that you are given as a universal basic income, it will mitigate some of the monetary costs associated with participating, right? It lowers the opportunity cost associated with voting, in other words. Now, other than that, more importantly, right, the idea would be that if you wanted to, when I did the thought experiment just now, I asked you to think about the various situations, right? Perhaps it would be that maybe you had work to do, right? You had to work a part-time job to have allowance, or you have to support for your family, so on, right? Then the idea would be, if you have a basic income, that would alleviate the extent to which you can need to rely on employment for survival. That will give you time to engage in participation. So if we see, first of all, it mitigates monetary costs, because we understand the cost of participation is, one of it might be monetary, another cost might be time, and we put 2 and 3 together, we see that a basic income might mitigate quite to some significant extent the cost of associated with participation, and that it might allow people to participate as fully as they wish, right? Because now they are freed up from having to pay attention to their work, or the monetary cost involved with participation, or the opportunity cost sometimes involved participation. But one question we might have, are there important limits to the basic income's impact on participation? So there's a podcast I've put up on democracy vouchers where you can learn more about this situation. And in general, it might be that if there's a general lack of concern about politics, then that doesn't really seem to actually have an impact, right? And if there's a sort of disinterest in civic participation due to sort of larger structural problems, then we can't really resolve that problem by just giving a UBI. This is something I think that when we get to pre-distribution and redistribution, this is an important point, right? Because the thought is that it is not enough to give a basic income to attempt to remedy the basic structure of the society by then getting people to vote, vote, right? To free up opportunity costs. But the problem would be that if people are not already disposed to see that their political action is efficacious or that they have a role to play in determining political outcomes, then giving them money is not likely to actually push the needle. And you can listen to the podcast to sort of understand this thought a bit more. So the tentative conclusion might be that UBI might help participation and democratization, but it's still unclear the extent to which it might be effective in doing so, right? But in theory, this does seem to be something that it might do. Now let's look at another aspect of UBI and its motivations with respect to employment. So if you recall, in the beginning of this video, I talked about why there is a sort of context for UBI, besides the general sort of context about it becoming important as a way of enhancing well-being, things like that, right? And one of the things that we mentioned earlier is this idea about UBI becoming important because of automation. And also, as we've seen, rising inequality and its impact on participation and life in general, right? And the automation is linked to the structural changes in the economy and, of course, globalization, where the nation states are under pressure to provide employment, right? And the more important thing is that our social policy system is sort of significantly tied to employment. So the way in which we give out aid and policy and help people with and provide for the society is very tied to employment. And we see this most clearly in the time of COVID-19, right? This is, I think, most apparent during this particular time. Well, as we've seen, right, there's this idea that coronavirus might exacerbate globalization, might sort of end globalization, right? But it is also exposing a lot of market vulnerabilities in terms of structural unemployment. There's a lot of concerns about inequality, as we have seen. There's also concerns about how certain types of workers might not be given enough protections. This is especially a big concern and a big justification for UBI, as you'll see later on. And there's also sort of significant structural changes with respect to certain key parts of the economy, such as the travel sector, tourism sector, and there's also huge changes in social policy to deal with this crisis, right? And of course, in our own context, we have seen that COVID-19 can be very disruptive of educational policies, and we are still, to some significant extent, facing this type of situation. And I hope that the experience has not been too deficient, and if it has, please let me know how I can improve. But in general, in short, we have been hearing this, I think, for a year now. We're kind of sick of it, but basically the idea is that these are unprecedented times which have accentuated many social tensions and brought to fore many of these problems. And at the same time, it has also, I believe, led to a significant outgrowth of aid within the community, right? So you can see these are all examples of how the community has stepped up to provide aid in this type of crisis, in this type of structural need, when there's a sort of gap in social policy and also a gap in the state for actually meeting certain kinds of needs. And we also see this on our own campuses, But of course, the problem with these types of mutual aid schemes, right, these are what it's called, is that they are often limited, right? So one reason why UBI discussions have especially become so popular is precisely because of the situation we face now, right? Where it is a time where you have significant unemployment, many people are struggling to make ends meet, many people are facing situations where they are unable to cope with the economic fallout from the situation, from the pandemic, and we have seen, as I already mentioned, a sort of rollout of a series of new social policies and budgets precisely to help with this kind of new situation, right? And in America, we also see that this idea that lawmakers should provide the resources, right, in terms of cash to address this sort of very pressing and urgent need, right? And although there's been a backlog, but they have actually given out a few stimulus checks, and I think that they are trying to push through the next one in the US currently. And we also see it in the US again, we see it also in Britain, right? But here is, I think the quote here is very good, right? This idea that COVID-19 is upending people's lives in drastic and unpredictable ways, right? And so why is UBI good? Because cash is flexible. It allows you can choose what to do with it, right? It gives people the confidence and a degree of certainty given how unpredictable their lives have become. So one question we might ask is, why is it that COVID-19 is especially so hard hitting? Well, because many people have lost their jobs because people just cannot go out and work and do the same things that they have done before, right? So we see first very clearly that in a lot of areas of our life, we have seen that there's a link between employment, income, and security, right? If you don't work, you don't get income. You don't get income, you can't get the money to buy the basic needs that you have. And we have also seen quite clearly that you might need, right, to be employed in order to have insurance, in order to be given some beyond the basic minimum of certain kind of healthcare needs. But what is sort of troubling about the situation that we are in, and which we have recovered to some degree, is that there's a precarity of unemployment in these kinds of times. But because employment is tied to income, which is tied to security, which is tied to healthcare, when you have precarity of employment, you naturally have precarity of income, and therefore security, and therefore healthcare, which has these kinds of knock-on effects, right? So a social policy structure which relies on employment as the sort of basis of providing aid and also the basis of survival necessarily faces this kind of huge structural challenge when many jobs are threatened. So in stark terms, here is a op-ed written by Chia Mui Hong regarding Singapore, which was written many years ago, 2018, right? But which is very sort of relevant now, right? It says, in Singapore, if you're jobless for a month or two, hopefully your savings or family friends can tide you over. You can get short-term assistance, right? So this was before COVID-19 struck, right? If we didn't have in place certain kinds of policies, right, this would have been the situation we have faced, right? So if you're jobless for a significant period of time, there's no real safety net for you, right? So then you have to think about how to take on certain drastic life changes. So in effect, what this means is that our social policy system assumes that people are either employed or looking for employment. But this often ignores the partially employed. This also doesn't really take into account gig economy workers, right? And so tying social assistance, providing aid, providing subsidies to employment can deepen inequality, especially in a time like this, right, where people lose their jobs and they cannot get into the job market effectively or quickly enough, right? they might get caught in a vicious cycle of poverty for a number of years, right? Which is precisely the kind of situation that we would want to avoid in order to avoid huge unequal effects. So, in the larger point of view, right, there's this idea, first of all, as we've seen, that social policy and aid is tied to employment, and UBI might help de-link that. But what about sort of more general, less structural employment threats, right? What if things are sort of running, as they say, normal, right? Well, how normal the normal was is a big question, right? But assume that, right, economy that doesn't face this kind of threats, right? How would the UBI help in those types of situations? Well, one type of situation is that actually it will help to improve the bargaining power of the poorest individuals, right? So people who might be forced to work, not necessarily forced, but have not much choice but to work in certain kinds of working conditions, for example, in a situation where they will have to work under a very mean boss, or bad working conditions where they might be that's not safe or sanitary, right? They can refuse to enter in this kind of employment, right? And the thought is also that UBI can reshape the relationship between employment, marriage, and citizenship. And you'll see that in a bit. So one thought experiment I want you to have is, suppose you're guaranteed $1,000 a month for the rest of your life after graduation. Would you change your course of study or plans after graduation, right? So this idea here is to sort of invite you to think about how is it that that kind of extra money might actually change the way you might plan your life. And one thought I think that is important is that employment and income are very linked, as we discussed, right? And as we already mentioned, most of employment income is tied to employment, or it might be tied to the new fortunes of speculation. So I think that is sort of one of the reasons why people are very excited by the possibility of using passive income, right? So that's why on YouTube, for example, you always get, "Hi, I'm Dominic. Hi, I'm Imran, and I'm here to tell you how you can build passive income using my manual on YouTube." Right? So this goal that we are trying to move from just earning money through our jobs, right, but through earning money through other ways, is the way to break free from this link between employment and income. And a basic income can change that link, right? Beyond just hoping that Dominic is not actually trying to pull a fast one on us, but actually giving us some useful information. But if he didn't, right, a UBI can actually help us. It frees us up from the competitive market, right, where we don't have to survive just based on having this kind of being in this kind of rat. Another feature of employment is not just that income is linked to employment, which is one sort of serious worry for many people, right? But also that employment constrains freedom, right? You are forced to, in certain workplaces, to work under conditions which are not very good. You're constantly trying to put out something, right? Just like I have authority to tell you do this assignment, might not understand why, right? And if you don't, please let me know so I can make it clear and explain the justification for why I do certain things. But your employers, right, many of them might not always have that kind of reciprocal relationship, right? In fact, as we have discussed, part of employer-employee relationships is sometimes built on it, creating a hierarchy between workers and managers, right, where this can create unhealthy and unsafe working environment. And workplaces can also be undemocratic because they can potentially stifle employees' political and civil rights, as you can see this example here, right, how workplaces might force people to attend certain kind of political rallies that might not be in line with their beliefs. In short, we see that income is tied to employment, employment might constrain freedom, UBI might help to break links between income and employment, and might actually enable people to make better choices that they value more. recall something that Anderson said about luck egalitarianism. That luck egalitarianism sort of justifies lack of wages of caregiving and also this general stigmatization of caregiving, right? So there's this idea that in general in our society, caregiving is not valued that much, right? So one question we might have is, can a UBI help in this regard? So let's take a look. Right, so first of all, as we've seen, as I discussed previously in that Anderson video, is that men tend to monopolize many higher paying, prestigious, full-time paid employment jobs. And we can also see this in leadership positions. 15% of firms are headed by female CEOs. Lack of representation of women in the workforce in top positions, and in general, women also do a disproportionate share of unpaid work in the home, right? So, but now you might ask, well, what kind of evidence do we have for this? First of all, let's go through the assumptions are made in this kind of argument. First of all, we're primarily talking about heterosexual families where there's a kind of gendered division of labor in the workplace. And interestingly, what we find is in some studies is that one question we might have, as we mentioned, is what kind of evidence we might have. And we can see that in some research, same-sex couples tend to have a more egalitarian distribution of chores. But what's interesting is that until they have a child, then there's sort of more unequal division of labor. So then you might say, well, what's the problem, right? There doesn't seem to be in the same-sex couples case that if it's unequal, that so there's nothing really wrong with that situation, right? But what might be different about these cases is that there's still a tendency to assume that in heterosexual couples, women should do the bulk of the work. So there's not a lot of discussion, unlike in a same-sex marriage, same-sex couples, right? They have a lot of discussion about how they should distribute the work. And some research suggests that this is the case, that women still do the bulk of the work even when they are making more of the money, right? So here, as you can see, even winning wives don't get equality in the home, right? It's this idea that even when the woman is sort of actually having more economic power, they don't actually get to take on less of the household division of labor. And we can also see here that in Singapore, this is also a big concern, right? Older Singapore women do not accumulate as much savings, so that sort of leads to this kind of economic dependency, which we have discussed previously. And here's some internet ethnography that I think sort of maybe helps us to sort of see this a bit more carefully, right? Or more clearly, I should say. Here is things taken from Reddit, which is asking, am I the a-hole, right? And you can see, right, what the men sort of think, right? Where his idea is that am I bad for thinking that, you know, household chores are easier than work, right? I expect to come home and be fed, but there's nothing, right? And in this case even, right, and am I the one that should be expecting more from my husband who's staying at home and he's not working, right? Should I expect him to do, am I the bad person for asking him to do household chores, right? So in this second case, there's a clear belief that women should do the work, right? And there's something wrong with me if I'm expecting my husband to do the chores. So this is illustrative of this idea that there's an expectation that women should pick up the slack when it comes to household chores. And you can see this again, right? Am I the bad person for not wanting to do household chores, right? And then he said, because I'm paying the bills, right? Giving allowance, right? So even though my wife is pregnant, right? So here the situation is that the wife is pregnant, right? And she's asking him to do certain types of chores, but he doesn't want to do it, right? And here again, right, now in this couple, the wife says she wants to change the way she do things, but then the husband is unhappy about that, right? And he says that that's not true because she has no free time, but she spends 1 hour on the computer, right? There's this idea that why are you expecting or putting the onus on the woman to be the one to do the household chores? So the thought here is that in the video that you watched by Philip Van Paris, right, that proponents of UBI focus on freedom from employment, like we discussed just now, right? Ability to choose what you want that might lead to a more creative and flourishing society, like Van Paris notes. But it ignores the gender division of labor, which I think we have some quite compelling statistical and anecdotal evidence from Reddit, as we discussed, to show that it still exists. Then basic income, on this view, might be seen as a way of recognizing household labor as labor, right? A way of saying everyone, including housewives or people who do household chores, women, right? They should just recognize household labor as labor, right? And of course, everyone here would also include people of whatever gender, male or otherwise, right? Non-binary individuals would also be included, right? Whoever does household work will get some kind of monetary compensation for doing that work. So one question that you might have is, will this incentivize men to take on more of their share of the chores, right? And this is an open question that we don't really know the answer to, right? We can rely on making inferences about how things have changed previously, and that might seem to be the case, but whether it is actually going to be the case is a big question, is a difficult question to answer specifically. But the more important point that some scholars want to make is this, right? It's that we tend to have this vision of the household as an egalitarian relationship, right? Which we sort of espoused, which I sort of elucidated in when talking about relational egalitarianism. But in reality, right, this idea that the household is this kind of paradigm of cooperation and reciprocity when it's actually unequal is not really the case, right? It's not really the case. There's always this kind of bastion of reciprocity and equality. And then this idea might be that if we have UBI, we can actually deepen reciprocity society-wide, right? So we have reciprocal relationships between citizens, and we can also have reciprocal relationships between partners and in a marriage. And that sort of gives us an important political argument for UBI that will help, in general, the society to recognize that UBI is a deep moral and political moral issues, or that UBI is a deep moral issue that requires a political solution, right? And this, as we will see, relates to the issue of feasibility, right? How might we convince the public that UBI might be worthwhile? This might be one of the ways. So we can see here that UBI can actually help people leave, women especially, leave certain kinds of relationships because it enables them to provide them with the kind of monetary resources that they might not always have because of the economic dependency laid out earlier. And so here is the argument in general form, right? The gender division of labor often leads to marginalization and exclusion of women from the workplace. We saw that in terms of this disparity between CPF savings between men and women. We also see that in the disparity between representation and leadership roles in the workplace. And so the marginalization and exclusion of women from the workplace leaves them in an economically precarious position. We saw that again with CPF. We see that in general about how some women might be facing, single mothers, and might be facing issues when they go through divorce, or their spouse might pass away, right? So with respect to abusive and exploitative relationships, right, women might find it difficult to leave this type of relationships. But with a UBI in place, right, that can alleviate some of the economic precarity that women might find themselves in. And so, it might potentially promote women's freedom to exit relationships they find abusive and exploitative. So, in conclusion, UBI appears to have many benefits which are related to the theories that we have discussed in the first half of this semester. First of all, it seems that it can allow us to hold people responsible without necessarily treating them unnecessarily harshly. So let me explain what this means, right? So if you give people UBI, they can choose to spend the money how they wish. Spend it on healthcare, whatever it might be. Right? But if they lead on to bad healthcare choices, right, of course we're still going to provide them with a UBI. So maybe they can use that money to do something else later, right? But they have a choice how to use that money and in what situation they would like to see themselves in. So the idea is that we do not deny them of a basic standard of living in terms of cash, but they can choose how they want to use this. But if we use UBI as a supplement, then we would still provide them with some basic healthcare. If we use it as a replacement, right, we can hold them responsible without providing healthcare, but we don't treat them unnecessarily harshly because we still provide them with the basic means of a sort of basic life, right? Second thing that it's important is delinking survival from employment, right? Because we have discussed why income is tied to employment constrains freedom, and so on. Finally, UBI can have important democratization effects in terms of improving participation, although this might be limited. And perhaps the one sort of very interesting thought is that UBI might improve women's freedom because it actually gives monetary recognition for caregiving labor. Now, from the relational egalitarian perspective, it seems that the last 2 points might actually be very important, right? Because as we recall, relational egalitarians hold that what is important is that equality should enable citizens to relate to one another as equals. And this requires political equality, right? So a society where everyone can make collective decisions equally. And democratization seems to help with that. And relating to one another as equals also means that there must be no gender hierarchies in the society, right? And promoting women's freedom is related, of course, directly to ensuring that women have the equal status in the society. So it seems that UBI might actually be a good amalgamation of non-egalitarian concerns about holding people responsible, but still giving them some bare minimum. It might actually help us with delinking survival from employment, and it might help democratization and women's freedom, which are concerns that the relational egalitarian has. So it seems that UBI should be an attractive set of a very attractive set of policies that will appeal to both the non-egalitarian and the relational egalitarian. Is this true? That's the question we'll look at in class. Thank you and see you there.